Why did seeing my son deliver packages in the pouring rain make my hands shake so hard I almost dropped my coffee cup? Why was my daughter-in-law's father standing in our driveway 3 days later demanding I sign papers about the house my late husband built with his own hands? And why did my 7-year-old grandson look at me in the school parking lot and say, "Grandma, Mommy says you're being mean to Daddy"? I'm 63 years old. I raised my son in this house. My husband died 4 years ago, and I thought I knew what grief looked like. I thought I understood what it meant to rebuild a life alone. But nothing prepared me for the moment I turned onto Maple Grove Boulevard on a Tuesday afternoon in October and saw my son wearing a brown uniform and carrying boxes up a walkway in the rain, while his father-in-law stood on the covered porch of that same house, arms crossed, watching him like he was watching hired help. My son, my boy. The one who graduated with honors from State University. The one who worked in IT for 12 years. The one who my husband used to call our steady one because he never caused trouble, never asked for handouts, never made waves. And there he was, soaked through, delivering packages while Richard, his wife's father, just stood there with that look on his face. That look I'd seen before at family dinners. That look that said, "You're not quite good enough for my daughter." If this story has already touched your heart, subscribe now, leave a like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I didn't mean to follow him. I was coming back from the grocery store. I'd taken the long way because I still couldn't drive past the hospital without my chest getting tight. 4 years since the heart attack took my husband, and some days it still felt like 4 minutes. I was thinking about whether to make pot roast for Sunday dinner, whether my grandson would eat carrots if I hid them in the gravy, normal grandmother thoughts. And then I saw the brown truck, and something made me look twice at the driver. It was the way he moved. Mothers know their children's bodies, the slope of shoulders, the way he favored his left leg a little because of the high school football injury that never quite healed right. I slowed down. I told myself I was being silly. But then he turned, and I saw his face, and my whole body went cold. My son was delivering packages in the rain on a Tuesday afternoon when he should have been at work. When he should have been at the office where he'd been for over a decade, the place that gave him decent health insurance and a retirement account and enough stability to buy the house he and Melissa moved into 6 years ago. The house I helped them with the down payment for. The house where my grandson was born. I pulled over 2 blocks away. My hands were shaking. I sat there watching him in my rearview mirror as he jogged back to the truck, climbed in, drove to the next stop. Professional. Efficient, like he'd been doing this for months. How long had this been going on? And why didn't I know? Why didn't he tell me? I thought about the last 3 Sunday dinners. He'd seemed tired, more quiet than usual. Melissa had done most of the talking, telling stories about her father's new consulting business, about the vacation home Richard and her mother just bought in the mountains, about opportunities and investments, and moving forward. My son had just nodded and cut his grandson's chicken into small pieces and asked me if I needed help with the gutters before winter. I'd thought he was just grieving still, missing his father. My husband had been his hero. They'd built the deck together, fixed cars in the driveway. My husband taught him about insurance and mortgages and how to read a contract. He used to say, "Son, a man takes care of what's his. A man doesn't run from hard work. A man keeps his word." And there was my son, in the rain, delivering boxes, while Richard stood on a covered porch watching him with that look. I drove home. I made myself tea. I sat at the kitchen table, where my husband used to read the paper every morning, and I tried to think. The house was too quiet. It had been too quiet for 4 years. Sometimes I left the TV on just to hear voices. I looked at the stack of mail I'd been avoiding. Property tax notice, insurance renewal, the paperwork for the refinance I'd been considering, because the roof needed work and the furnace was making noises. My husband had left me the house free and clear. 32 years of payments, done. He'd made sure of that. He had a small life insurance policy, enough to cover the funeral and give me a cushion. Not enough to be rich, but enough to breathe. He used to say, "This house is your security, honey. Nobody can take this from you." I thought about my grandson, 7 years old, gap-toothed smile, obsessed with dinosaurs. He came over every Saturday morning and we made pancakes, and he told me facts about velociraptors, while I pretended I didn't already know them from the 17 times he'd told me before. He was my light, my reason to get up on the dark days, my proof that life keeps going. But he hadn't been over in 2 weeks. Melissa kept texting that they were busy. Soccer practice, birthday parties, errands, always something. And when I'd suggested coming to them, she'd said it wasn't a good time. Maybe next week. Richard and her mother were visiting and the house was chaotic. 2 questions sat in my stomach like stones. What happened to my son's job? And why was I the last to know? The next morning I called him. He didn't answer. I texted. He replied 4 hours later. Sorry, busy, talk later. I called Melissa, straight to voicemail. I sat with my phone in my hand, and I felt something I hadn't felt since my husband died. I felt alone in a way that had nothing to do with being widowed. Friday came. Still no real conversation. Just short text. We're fine. Don't worry. Everything's under control. The words people use when nothing is under control. Saturday morning. No pancakes. No grandson. No sticky fingers on my counters. No dinosaur facts. Just silence, and a text from Melissa that said, "Sorry, today's not good. We'll reschedule." I sat in the kitchen and I cried. Not pretty crying. The ugly kind. The kind where you're mad at yourself for crying because you're 63 years old and you've survived worse. But I hadn't survived worse. Losing my husband was the worst thing that ever happened to me. This was different. This was watching my son disappear while he was still alive. Sunday afternoon, my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I'd given up on Sunday dinner. I opened the door, and there was Richard, tall, silver-haired, expensive watch, smile that never reached his eyes, and behind him, Melissa. She wouldn't look at me. Richard said, "We need to talk." He said it like a man used to being listened to, like a man who ran a consulting firm and closed deals and made things happen. He walked into my house without waiting for an invitation. Melissa followed. She was carrying a folder. I should have known then, but I was still thinking like a grandmother. I was thinking, maybe this was about my son's job. Maybe Richard was here to help. He was successful. He had connections. Maybe he was going to tell me he found my son something better. We sat in my living room, the room where my husband and I used to watch old movies on Friday nights, the room where my grandson played with his toy trucks on the carpet. Richard sat in my husband's chair, and I almost told him to move, but I didn't. Melissa sat on the couch and opened the folder. Richard said, "Your son lost his job 7 months ago." He said it flat, like he was reporting weather, laid off, downsizing, technology sector contraction. He made it sound inevitable, like my son had just been unlucky. 7 months. My son had been unemployed for 7 months and nobody told me. Richard said they'd been helping, covering bills, making mortgage payments, keeping things afloat. He used that word. Afloat. Like my son was drowning and they were the life raft. He said, "We've been very generous. We care about Melissa and our grandson. We want to make sure they're stable." I found my voice. I said, "Why didn't he tell me?" I said, "I could have helped. I have savings. I could have done something." Richard looked at Melissa. She looked at the folder. He said, "That's actually why we're here." He said, "We need to talk about options, long-term solutions." He said, "Your son is doing his best, but delivery work isn't going to cover their mortgage. It's not going to build a future." He said, "We need to be realistic." And then he said, "This house." He gestured around my living room. He said, "It's a valuable asset. 3 bedrooms, good neighborhood, near the elementary school where my grandson would start 3rd grade next year." He said, "It's just you here." He said, "It's a lot of house for one person." He said, "Have you thought about downsizing?" The word hung in the air. Downsizing. Like I was a corporation. Like my life could be made more efficient. Melissa finally spoke. She said, "Mom, we're just trying to help." Her voice was gentle, careful, like she was talking to someone fragile. She said, "Richard thinks if you sold this house, you could move somewhere smaller, an apartment maybe, something easier to maintain, something with less upkeep, and the money from the sale could help us, could help your son, could help make sure your grandson has stability." I stared at her. I said, "This is my home." I said, "My husband built the deck." I said, "My son grew up here." I said, "This is where we had Christmas morning and birthday parties and every important moment of my family's life." Richard leaned forward. He said, "I understand, this is emotional." He said, "But we have to think practically." He said, "Melissa and my son had already missed 2 mortgage payments. The bank was sending letters." He said, "If they lost their house, where would my grandson live?" He said, "Think about what's best for the child. My grandson, my light, my reason to get up in the morning." Richard said, "We've been covering their bills, but we can't do it indefinitely." He said we have our own retirement to think about, our own future. He said the fair thing, the family thing, would be for everyone to contribute. He said you could help your son. You could secure your grandson's future. You could make sure Melissa doesn't lose everything she's worked for. He made it sound so reasonable, so logical, so obvious. Melissa slid papers across my coffee table. She said we had a real estate agent come look. Just preliminary, just to get an idea. She said the house could sell for enough to pay off their mortgage completely and still leave me with money for a nice apartment. She said we could all move forward. She said it would be better for everyone. I looked at the papers. Market analysis, comparable sales, projected listing price. They'd already had someone come to my house. They'd already started planning. I said, when did an agent come here? Melissa said last Tuesday, when you were at your book club. She said we still have the spare key you gave us years ago. She said we just wanted to get information. She said it wasn't a big deal. They'd been in my house without telling me. They'd had a stranger walk through my bedroom, my kitchen, the room where my husband died. They'd put a price on my memories. I stood up. I said, I need you to leave. My voice wasn't shaking anymore. It was flat, hard. I didn't recognize it. Richard said, don't be emotional about this. He said, take a few days. Think about it. He said, we're not trying to pressure you. He said, we're family. He said, this is about helping each other. I said, get out of my house. They left. Melissa took the folder, but the papers stayed on my coffee table. I sat alone in the quiet, and I looked at them. Square footage, lot size, market value, $380,000. That's what they thought my life was worth. I called my son that night. He answered this time. I said, did you know about this? I said, did you ask your father-in-law to come talk to me about selling my house? Long silence. Then he said, Mom, I didn't know he was going to do it like that. He said, I'm sorry. He said things are just really hard right now. He said Melissa's parents have been helping, and Richard thinks he knows what's best, and He stopped. I waited. He said, I'm trying, Mom. I'm working. I'm doing everything I can, but it's not enough. And Richard keeps saying if we just had more capital, if we just had a cushion, we could get ahead. He said Melissa thinks her dad's right. He said everyone thinks it makes sense except me, and I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. I said, do you want me to sell my house? Another long silence. Then he said, I don't want you to do anything you don't want to do. But he didn't say no. I hung up. I sat in the dark. I thought about my husband. What would he say? What would he do? He'd built this house for me, for us, for our future. He'd worked overtime and weekends, and he'd made every payment on time for 32 years, so I'd never have to worry. So I'd always have a place that was mine. And now they wanted me to give it away, because my son couldn't keep a job, and his wife's father had opinions, and my grandson needed stability. Sunday morning came. No pancakes, no dinosaur facts, just silence. I made coffee. I sat at the table. I looked at the papers still on my coffee table, and I felt something shift inside me. Not anger yet, something colder, something clearer. I called my husband's best friend, Tom, retired now, lived 2 streets over, had been at our wedding, had helped carry the casket. I said, Tom, I need help. I said, I don't know what I'm doing, but I think something's wrong. He came over in 20 minutes. I showed him the papers. I told him everything. He read through it all. Then he said, where's your deed? Where's your will? Where's all your husband's paperwork? I brought him the file cabinet from the closet, the one I'd been avoiding for 4 years, the one full of documents I didn't understand. Tom went through it systematically. He made notes. He asked questions. He said, okay. He said, listen. He said, your house is in your name only. Your husband made sure of that. You don't owe anyone anything. Your mortgage is paid. Your property taxes are current. Nobody can make you sell. I said, but they need help. I said, my son is struggling. I said, my grandson. Tom said, your grandson needs his father to be a man. He said, your son needs to figure this out without taking his mother's home. He said, this Richard character, I don't like it. I don't like any of it. He said, your husband would be furious. He was right. My husband would have been furious. But my husband was dead, and I was here alone trying to figure out how to be a mother and a grandmother without being a doormat. Tom said, I'm going to give you a name. Lawyer. Good one. Used to work with your husband on the business stuff back in the day. He said, you call her. You tell her what's happening. You protect yourself. He said, because I'm telling you right now, this doesn't feel right. This feels like someone's trying to push you into something fast. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my grandson, his gap-toothed smile, the way he hugged me, the way he said, "I love you, Grandma," without any hesitation. What if I said no? What if I didn't sell? Would they keep him from me? Would Melissa use him as leverage? Monday morning, I called the lawyer. Her name was Patricia Chen. She said she remembered my husband. She said she was sorry for my loss. She said, "Tell me what's going on." I told her. All of it. The papers, the real estate agent, the pressure. She listened without interrupting. Then she said, "I need you to understand something. Nobody can force you to sell your home. That's not how this works. But I need to know, have you signed anything? Given anyone power of attorney? Made any promises?" I said no. Nothing. She said, "Good." She said, "Don't sign anything. Don't make any verbal agreements. Don't let anyone pressure you." She said, "I'm going to send you a document, a letter. You can show it to your son and his in-laws. It'll make it clear that you're represented and that any further discussions go through me." She said, "Sometimes people back off when they realize you're not alone." I said, "What if they keep my grandson from me?" Her voice softened. She said, "I can't control that. Family relationships are complicated, but I can tell you this. If they're trying to manipulate you through your grandchild, that tells you what kind of people you're dealing with, and you need to protect yourself." The letter came 2 days later, professional, firm. It stated that I was under no legal obligation to sell my property. It requested that all future communications regarding my assets be directed to Patricia's office. It said I was taking time to consider my options and would not be rushed into any decisions. I made copies. I put one in an envelope. I drove to my son's house. Melissa answered the door. She looked surprised. She said, "Mom, we weren't expecting you." She didn't invite me in. I handed her the envelope. I said, "This is from my lawyer." I said, "I'm not selling my house." I said, "If you and Richard and my son want to talk to me about anything related to my property or my finances, you can contact her." Melissa's face changed. She said, "Mom, don't be like this." She said, "We're just trying to help." She said, "You're making this harder than it needs to be." She said, "Richard's going to be disappointed." She said, "This isn't how family treats each other." I said, "Family doesn't have real estate agents walk through my house without permission." I said, "Family doesn't ambush me with papers and demands." I said, "Family doesn't try to take my home." She said, "We're not taking anything." She said it was a suggestion, an option. She said, "You're being dramatic." I heard my grandson's voice from inside. "Mommy, is that Grandma? Is she here for pancakes?" Melissa stepped outside and pulled the door mostly closed behind her. She said, "Now's not a good time." She said, "He's about to go to a birthday party." She said, "Maybe next week." She said, "We'll call you." The door closed. I stood on the porch where my son had stood soaking wet delivering packages while his father-in-law watched with contempt. I drove home. I cried in my driveway for 10 minutes before I could go inside. That week was quiet. No calls, no texts, no Sunday dinner invitation. I called my son, and it went to voicemail. I texted Melissa and got one-word responses. Busy. Later. Sorry. Friday afternoon, my doorbell rang. I almost didn't answer, but I looked through the window and saw Tom, and with him, a woman about my age, neat gray hair, kind face. Tom said, "This is Janet. She's from the church. She's also on the board at the community center. She said she wants to talk to you." We sat in my kitchen. Janet said, "I heard through the grapevine that you might be going through something." She said, "I don't want to pry, but I want you to know you're not alone." She said, "I went through something similar 5 years ago. My daughter-in-law tried to convince me to sell my house and move in with them. Said it would be easier. Said we could all help each other." She said it took me almost losing everything to realize it wasn't about helping me. It was about helping themselves. I asked what happened. She said, "I said no. I set boundaries. My daughter-in-law stopped speaking to me for 8 months. My son was caught in the middle. My grandkids were kept from me. She said it was the hardest thing I ever did. But eventually my son saw what was happening. Eventually he stood up. She said, "We have a relationship now. It's different. It's careful. But it's honest." She said, "I'm telling you this because you need to know it might get worse before it gets better. You need to know they might use your grandson. They might tell people you're difficult. They might paint you as selfish. But you're not selfish for protecting what's yours. You're not wrong for saying no." Tom said, "We're here, both of us. You're not alone in this." I cried again. I seem to be doing a lot of that lately. But this time, it wasn't just grief. It was relief. Someone understood. Someone believed me. That weekend I didn't expect pancakes, and I didn't get them. I cleaned the house. I worked in the garden. I tried to pretend my heart wasn't broken every time I looked at the kitchen table where my grandson should have been sitting. Monday morning, Patricia called. She said I got a call from Richard. He said he wanted to discuss your situation. He said he's concerned about your decision-making. He implied you might not be thinking clearly. He used the phrase diminished capacity. My blood went cold. I said, what does that mean? She said he's testing the waters, seeing if he can paint you as incompetent, as someone who can't manage their own affairs. It's a tactic, not a particularly ethical one. She said I shut it down. I told him you're perfectly competent, and if he has concerns, he's welcome to file something official so we can address it in court. She said he backed off fast. She said bullies usually do when you stand up to them. I said, can he really do that? Can he try to say I'm incompetent? Patricia said he could try, but he'd need evidence. Medical records, documentation, witnesses. He doesn't have that because it's not true. She said, I'm not worried about that. What I'm worried about is what else he might try. She said, keep records of everything. Texts, calls, any interactions with your son or Melissa. Document it all. She said, I want to be prepared. That night, I couldn't eat. I sat in the dark and thought about diminished capacity, about being painted as a confused old woman who couldn't manage her own life, about losing everything because someone decided I was too old to say no. My husband used to say the only thing you really own in this life is your dignity. Don't let anyone take that from you. I thought about dignity, about what it meant to be 63 and widowed and alone and trying to hold on to the last piece of my husband's love while my son delivered packages in the rain and my grandson learned that grandma was the problem. Wednesday brought a text from Melissa. Just wanted to let you know we're not going to be able to do Sunday dinners for a while. Things are complicated right now. We think it's best if we take some space. We'll let you know when we're ready to reconnect. Hope you understand. Space. That pleasant word people use when they mean punishment. When they mean you didn't do what we wanted, so now you lose access to what you love most. I called my son. Voicemail again. I texted. No response. I sent another text. I said, I love you. I said, I'm not trying to hurt you. I said, I just want to protect what your father built for me. I said, please talk to me. He responded 2 hours later. Mom, I can't deal with this right now. Melissa's upset. Her father's upset. Everyone thinks you're being unreasonable. I need you to just think about the family. Think about your grandson. He needs stability. Stability. The magic word. The word that justified everything. The word that meant I should give up my home so my son wouldn't have to face the consequences of losing his job and my daughter-in-law wouldn't have to live within her means. I thought about my grandson. 7 years old. What was he learning right now? What was he being taught about family? About grandmothers? About what happens when someone says no? I went to Patricia's office the next day. I said I need to update my will. I said, I need to make sure if something happens to me, my house doesn't get eaten up by people who just want to sell it. She said smart. She said, let's make sure everything is clear. Who gets what? Under what conditions? No ambiguity. We spent 2 hours going through everything. My house, my savings, my husband's life insurance, the retirement account he'd left me. It wasn't a fortune. It was just enough to be comfortable, to not worry, to live out my days in peace. Patricia said you could also consider setting up a trust. She said it would protect your assets. Make it clear they're not for sale, not for negotiation. She said it would cost a little, but it would give you peace of mind. She said especially if Richard keeps pushing. I said do it, whatever it takes. That night I slept better than I had in weeks. Not because anything was solved, but because I'd done something. I'd stopped being passive. I'd stopped waiting for someone to tell me what to do. Saturday morning, my doorbell rang at 8 a.m. I opened it and found Richard. Alone this time. He said we need to talk. He said this has gone on long enough. He walked past me into my house without waiting. Just walked right in like he owned it. I followed him into my living room. He turned and said, you're being selfish. He said it straight out. No polite words. No pretense. He said, my daughter's marriage is falling apart because of financial stress. My grandson is suffering. Your son is working himself into the ground, and you're sitting here in a house that's too big for you, refusing to help because of what? Pride? Sentiment? I said, this is my home. I said, my husband. He cut me off. He said, your husband is dead. He said, that's harsh, but it's true. He's gone. You're alive. You have a family that needs you. He said, I've put over $40,000 into keeping your son afloat. Mortgage payments, car payment, insurance, credit cards. I've kept him from bankruptcy. And what have you contributed? I felt like I'd been slapped. I said I didn't know he needed help. I said nobody told me. Richard said because we knew you'd react like this. We knew you'd be difficult. He said Melissa said you'd make it about yourself, about your feelings, instead of about what's practical, what's necessary. He sat down in my husband's chair again. He said, here's what's going to happen. You're going to list this house. You're going to take the money and you're going to help your family. Or I'm going to make things very difficult for you. I said, what does that mean? He smiled, not a friendly smile. He said, you really want to test me? He said, I have lawyers. I have resources. I can make your life very complicated. I can tie up your finances. I can challenge your competency. I can make it so you don't see your grandson until he's 18. He said, is that what you want? Or do you want to be reasonable? My hands were shaking again, but not from fear this time, from rage. I said, get out of my house. He said, think about it. You have until next Friday. That's when the bank starts foreclosure proceedings on your son's house. He said, if you want your grandson to be homeless, that's on you. He stood up. He said, I expected more from you. Your husband was a good man. It's a shame you don't honor his memory by taking care of his son. He left. I stood in my living room and I shook, not from weakness, from fury, from the audacity of a man who walked into my house and threatened me, who used my husband's memory as a weapon, who held my grandson hostage to get what he wanted. I called Patricia. It was Saturday, but she answered. I told her everything, every word. She said, I'm coming over. Don't touch anything. Don't clean up. If he left fingerprints anywhere, I want them there. She said, and I want you to write down everything he said, every threat, every detail, right now while it's fresh. She came over with Tom. They sat with me while I wrote it all down. Patricia read it and said, this is good. This is very good. She said he just made a mistake. He just showed his hand. She said threats of financial manipulation and restricting access to a grandchild. That's not legal advice. That's intimidation. She said, we can use this. Tom said, did he mention the foreclosure date? Did he say next Friday? I said, yes. Why? Tom said, because that's 9 days from now. That's a hard deadline. He's trying to panic you, rush you, make you act without thinking. He said your husband used to say, when someone tries to rush you, that's when you slow down. Patricia said, we need to verify the foreclosure, find out if it's real, if it's actually happening. Because if Richard's lying, that's another problem for him. She said, I'll make some calls. I'll find out what's really going on with your son's mortgage. They left. I sat alone in the quiet. I thought about next Friday. 9 days. That's what Richard said. 9 days to save my son. 9 days to see my grandson again. 9 days to do the right thing. Except I didn't know what the right thing was anymore. Sunday came. No dinner, no family, just silence and the echo of Richard's threats. I went to church. Janet saw me and sat beside me. She held my hand during the service. Afterward, she said, how are you holding up? I told her about Richard, about the threats, about the deadline. She said, same playbook. They all use the same playbook. She said my daughter-in-law's father did the exact same thing. Gave me a deadline. Said if I didn't help, my son would lose everything. She said I called his bluff. Turned out they weren't in nearly as much trouble as they claimed. They just wanted money. I said, what if it's real this time? What if my son really is about to lose his house? She said, then he loses his house, and he learns, and he rebuilds. She said, you didn't cause this. You can't fix it by destroying yourself. She said, being a mother doesn't mean being a martyr. Monday, Patricia called. She said, I have information. Your son's mortgage. They're behind. 3 months. Not 7. Not foreclosure territory yet. The bank sent warnings, but no foreclosure proceedings have started. She said Richard lied to you. He moved up the timeline, made it sound more desperate than it is. I sat down hard. I said, why would he lie? Patricia said, because the truth didn't scare you enough. The truth meant you had time to think, time to get help, time to make a rational decision. He needed you panicked, she said. And here's something else. I did some digging. Richard's consulting business. It's not doing as well as he makes it sound. He took out a significant loan 6 months ago. He's extended himself. She said, I think he needs that money from your house. I think he's counting on it. My head was spinning. I said, so this isn't about helping my son? This is about Richard? Patricia said, I think it's both. I think your son needs help. But I think Richard saw an opportunity. Your house is valuable. You're alone. Your son is desperate. Perfect setup. He gets to look like a hero while essentially getting access to your equity. She said, and if you'd sold, I bet he would have had ideas about how to manage that money. Invest it. In his business, maybe. For your protection, of course. I felt sick. I said, what do I do? She said, you stand your ground. We document everything. We prepare for whatever he tries next. And we protect your assets. She said, I've already updated your will and started the trust paperwork. You're going to be fine. But you need to accept that your relationship with your son might get worse before it gets better. That week was a blur. No calls from my son, no texts from Melissa. Silence. I went through my days in a fog. Grocery shopping, laundry, cleaning. Normal activities that felt completely wrong because my grandson wasn't coming over. Because my family was gone. Thursday night, Tom came over with dinner. Casserole from his wife. He said, Janet told me to tell you you're stronger than you think. He said, and I'm here if you need anything. Anything at all. Friday came. The deadline Richard had set. I waited. Part of me expected him to show up, to make good on his threats. But nothing happened. No doorbell, no phone call, just quiet. Saturday morning, my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer. But something made me pick up. A woman's voice. Professional. She said, is this Helen? I said, yes. She said, my name is Carol Martinez. I'm a social worker with Child Protective Services. I received a call expressing concerns about your grandson's welfare. I need to ask you some questions. My vision tunneled. I said, what? What concerns? She said, someone reported that your grandson's living situation might be unstable, that there's financial hardship, that family relationships are strained, that there might be issues with care and supervision. She said I'm required to follow up. She asked if I had contact with my grandson, when I'd last seen him. If I had any concerns about his safety, I told her the truth. I said I haven't seen him in 3 weeks. His parents stopped letting me visit. I said, but there's nothing wrong with his care. His parents love him. There's financial stress, but that's not abuse. I said, this is about something else. This is about my house. This is about someone trying to force me to sell my home. Long silence. Then Carol said, can you explain that? I explained. Everything. Richard. The pressure. The threats. The fake deadline. She listened. Then she said, thank you for being honest with me. She said, I'm going to look into this further. She said, sometimes these calls are legitimate concerns. Sometimes they're manipulation. She said, I'll be in touch. I hung up, and I called Patricia immediately. I told her. She said he called CPS. Richard called Child Protective Services to pressure you. She said, that's a new low. She said, that's filing a false report. That's a crime. She said, did Carol give you her full name and contact information? I said, yes. Patricia said, forward it to me. I'm going to call her. I'm going to make sure she understands what's really happening here. She said, and Helen, this is actually good news. He's desperate. He's running out of plays. He's making mistakes. That weekend was the longest of my life. I waited for CPS to show up at my door. I waited for police. I waited for something terrible. But nothing came. Just silence. Monday, Carol called back. She said, I spoke with your attorney. I also spoke with your son and daughter-in-law. I did a home visit. Your grandson is fine. The home is clean and appropriate. There are no safety concerns. She said, I'm closing this case. She said off the record, I see this sometimes. Family disputes where someone uses the system as a weapon. It's not okay. She said, I've documented that this call appears to have been made in bad faith. She said if it happens again, there will be consequences for the person who filed it. I thanked her. I hung up. I cried. Relief this time. My grandson was okay. He was safe. But also grief, because what kind of family does this to each other? What kind of person calls CPS as a manipulation tactic? Patricia called that afternoon. She said we need to talk strategy. Richard just escalated. The CPS call gives us grounds for a restraining order if we want one. She said we could also pursue charges for filing a false report. She said, what do you want to do? I said, I don't know. I said, I just want this to stop. I just want my family back. She said, I understand, but here's what I want you to understand. This won't stop until you make it stop. Richard is going to keep pushing. He's invested now. He spent $40,000 on your son. He's expecting a return. She said you need to decide what your boundaries are and then enforce them. With consequences. That night, I sat in the dark and thought about consequences, about boundaries, about what my husband would do. He'd protect what was his. He'd stand his ground. But he'd also been a man who believed in family, in reconciliation, in doing the right thing. What was the right thing when the right thing meant losing your grandson? Tuesday, my doorbell rang. I looked through the window and saw my son, alone. No Melissa, no Richard, just him. I opened the door. He looked terrible, exhausted, older than his years. He said, "Mom, can I come in?" We sat at the kitchen table, the one where we'd had 1,000 meals, the one where my husband had taught him about budgets and savings and responsibility. My son put his head in his hands and said, "I don't know how this got so out of control." I waited. He said, "I lost my job, and I was ashamed. I didn't want to tell you. I didn't want you to be disappointed." Richard said he'd help, said it was no big deal, said family helps family. He said it would just be temporary, just until I got back on my feet. He looked up at me. He said, "But it wasn't temporary. I couldn't find anything that paid enough. Everything in tech wanted experience with new systems I didn't have. Everything else paid half what I used to make. I took the delivery job because it was something. It was money. But it wasn't enough." He said Richard kept covering things, kept saying, "Don't worry about it. We'll figure it out." I said, "When did he start talking about my house?" My son looked away. He said, "About a month ago." He said, "You're alone. You're sitting on equity. You could help." He made it sound so reasonable. He said we could all be in better shape. He said it wasn't asking you to give anything up, just to redistribute, to make things more fair. I said fair. I said my home for his loans. My son said, I know how it sounds now. But when you're drowning, Mom, when you can't see how you're going to make next month's payment, when your wife is crying because we might lose our house, when your kid asks why you're never home anymore, you listen to the person who says he has answers. I said, "Did you know he was going to call CPS?" His face went white. He said, "What?" I told him. I watched him process it, watched the realization hit. He said, "No." He said, "I didn't know." He said, "Mom, I swear I would never." I said, "But Melissa knew." "Your wife knew?" "Because I'm betting Richard told her. I'm betting she said nothing." He put his head back in his hands. He said, "This is so messed up." He said, "I don't even know what's true anymore. Melissa says you're being selfish. Richard says, you're not thinking clearly. But you're the same person you've always been. You're my mom." He said Dad would be so ashamed of me. I reached across the table. I took his hand. I said, "Your father would understand struggling. He would understand making mistakes. What he wouldn't understand is giving up, hiding, letting someone else control your life." My son said, "I don't know how to fix this. Richard keeps saying we're in too deep. We owe him too much. He said if I go against him, he'll call in the loans, demand payment. We'll lose everything anyway." I said, "How much do you owe him?" My son said, "Total? 43,000. Mortgage payments, car payment, credit cards he paid off for us, insurance." He said he has documentation. Everything's written down. I said, "Did you sign anything?" I said, "Is there a contract?" He said, "No. It was all verbal. Family helping family." He said, "But he has bank records, transfers, proof he paid things on our behalf." He said a lawyer could probably make a case. I sat back. I thought about $43,000, about the savings account my husband had left me, about the cushion that was supposed to last me the rest of my life. I said, "If I paid him back, would that end this? Would you be free?" My son looked up at me. He said, "Mom, no, I can't ask you to do that. This is my mess." I said, "I'm not asking for permission. I'm asking if it would work. If I paid Richard back everything you owe him, would he back off?" My son said, "I don't know. Maybe. But that's your money. That's your security. Dad left you that so you'd be okay." He said, "I can't take that from you." I said, "You're not taking it. I'm giving it. But I need you to promise me something. I need you to promise you'll get help, real help, financial counseling, career counseling, whatever it takes. I need you to promise you'll stand up to Richard. And I need you to promise I don't lose my grandson over this." He was crying now. My strong son who'd always held everything together. He said, "I promise." He said, "I'm so sorry, Mom, for all of it, for letting it get this bad, for listening to him instead of trusting you." We sat there and cried together. Father and son, mother and boy, just like we'd done when his father died, just like we'd done through every hard thing. And I realized this was the real inheritance my husband had left. Not the house, not the money. The ability to hold on through the hard parts, the ability to forgive. Wednesday, I went to Patricia's office with my son. We laid out a plan. Patricia would draft a formal payoff letter to Richard, the full amount, $43,000. In exchange, Richard would sign a release. No more loans, no more claims, no more involvement in my son's finances, and absolutely no more pressure on me regarding my house. Patricia said, "I'll make this airtight." She said, "Once he signs this, he can't come back. He can't claim you owe more. He can't use the grandchild. He's done." She said, "How do you want to handle the money?" I said, "I'll write a check to Richard directly." I said, "I want this clear. I'm paying my son's debt, not giving Richard access to my house, not selling anything, just settling accounts." Patricia said, "Smart." She said, "I'll have the paperwork ready by Friday." She said, "We'll set up a meeting. Neutral location, all parties present, everything documented, everything signed." She said, "And Helen, after this, you need to reset boundaries. Clear ones, about visits, about your grandson, about respect." She said, "Because your son can't protect you if he's not protecting himself." Friday came. We met at Patricia's office. Me, my son, Melissa, Richard. Patricia sat at the head of the table like a judge. She had the papers laid out, the release, the payoff letter, the check I'd already signed. Richard looked at me like he'd already won. He said, "I'm glad you came to your senses." He said, "This is the right thing to do. Family helping family." Patricia slid the papers across the table. She said, "This is a full settlement of all debts between your family and Helen's son." She said, "You will receive $43,000. In exchange, you will sign this release, waiving any future claims against Helen or her son. You will agree to cease all communication regarding Helen's property. You will agree not to interfere in Helen's relationship with her grandson." She said, "Read it carefully. Once you sign, this is done." Richard read it. His face changed. He said, "This isn't what we discussed." He said, "This was supposed to be the first step. She sells the house. We invest the money. We all benefit." He said, "This doesn't solve anything long term." Patricia said, "Helen is not selling her house. She never agreed to sell her house. She's settling your loans. That's all." She said, "You can sign this and walk away with $43,000. Or you can refuse, and we can go to court where we'll discuss your harassment, your threats, your false CPS report, and your attempt to defraud a widow." She said, "Your choice." Richard looked at Melissa. She looked down. He looked at my son. My son said, "Sign it, Richard. Please, just sign it." Richard signed. Patricia notarized it. She handed him my check. She said, "You're done here." She said, "If you contact Helen again about her property, if you attempt to restrict her access to her grandson, if you make any further threats, we'll pursue legal action." She said, "Do you understand?" He understood. He left without another word, just took the check and walked out. Melissa looked at me. She said, "I didn't know about the CPS call." She said, "My father did that on his own." She said, "I would never." I said, "But you didn't stop him." I said, "You let him pressure me. You let him walk into my house and threaten me. You used my grandson against me." She looked at my son. He said, "We need to talk. At home. About a lot of things." He looked at me. He said, "Mom, we'll call you. This weekend. We'll bring our son over for pancakes. If that's still okay." I said, "It's okay." I said, "It's always been okay." They left. Patricia and I sat in the quiet office. She said, "You did good." She said that took courage. She said a lot of people would have caved, given up the house just to keep the peace. I said, "I almost did." I said so many times I almost just said yes, just to see my grandson, just to stop the pain. Patricia said, "But you didn't." She said, "You set boundaries, you protected what was yours, and you still helped your son." She said that's the difference between being a doormat and being generous. You chose when and how to help. You didn't let someone force it from you. Saturday morning, my doorbell rang at 9 a.m. I opened it, and there was my grandson. He launched himself at me. "Grandma, I missed you. Are we making pancakes?" We made pancakes. My son and Melissa sat at the table. It was awkward, careful, but we were there. We were together. My grandson told me 17 facts about velociraptors. His parents smiled. We didn't talk about the house or the money or the ugliness. Not yet. That would come later, slowly, carefully, through family counseling that Melissa agreed they needed, through conversations about boundaries and respect and what healthy family actually looks like. But that morning, we just made pancakes. We laughed at my grandson's chocolate chip smile. We remembered that before all the pressure and the fear and the manipulation, we'd been a family who loved each other. And maybe we could be that again. Different, more cautious, but real. My son helped me clean up after they left. He said, "I'm going to pay you back, Mom." I said, "Every month, whatever I can, until you have your savings back." I said, "No." I said, "This is a gift." I said, "Your father's gift, through me, but I need you to pay it forward. When your son is grown, when he's struggling, don't let him face it alone. Don't let shame keep him from asking for help. And don't let anyone use that help as a weapon." He hugged me. He said, "I love you, Mom." He said, "I'm sorry it took almost losing you to remember that you're the strongest person I know." Monday, I met with Patricia one more time. She said, "The trust is finalized. Your house is protected. Your will is updated. Everything is clear." She said, "If Richard tries anything else, we're ready. But I don't think he will." She said, "You stood up to a bully, and bullies move on to easier targets." I said, "What about my son and Melissa?" I said, "What if they struggle again?" Patricia said, "Then they struggle, and they figure it out, like adults." She said, "You've given them the gift of a clean slate. No debt to Richard. No manipulation. What they do with that is up to them." She said, "Your job is to be a grandmother, not a bank, not a safety net for every bad decision, just a grandmother." I drove home. I walked through my house, the house my husband built, the house I'd almost lost. I ran my hand along the kitchen counter where we'd made 1,000 meals. I looked at the living room where my grandson played with his trucks. I went out to the deck my husband and son had built together, the wood worn smooth by years of summer evenings and birthday parties. This was mine. Not because I'd fought for it, because I'd refused to give it away out of fear. The following weeks settled into a new rhythm. My grandson came over every Saturday. Sometimes Melissa stayed. Sometimes she dropped him off and picked him up later. It was progress. She was trying. We both were. She apologized once, quietly, while my grandson was watching cartoons. She said, "I let my father convince me you were the problem." She said I was scared we'd lose everything, and he made it sound so simple. She said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I forgive you." And I meant it. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean everything went back to how it was, but it meant we could move forward. My son found a new job, not in IT, something different. Project management at a nonprofit. It paid less than his old job, but more than delivery work. He said it was good, steadier, better hours. He said he came home in time for dinner now. He said he was learning that more money wasn't always better if it came with more misery. He started paying down his credit cards, sold Melissa's SUV and got something more practical. They cut cable, cut subscriptions, started budgeting. He said it was hard. He said Melissa struggled with it. She'd grown up with money, with ease. Learning to say no to things was painful for her, but she was learning. Richard stopped calling, stopped showing up. I heard through Melissa that he was angry, that he'd expected the money from my house to invest in his business, that without it, he'd had to scale back, sell the vacation home in the mountains. She said he blamed me, said I'd been selfish, said I'd ruined an opportunity for everyone. I didn't lose sleep over Richard's opinion anymore. Tom and Janet became regular fixtures in my life. We had coffee every Thursday morning at the diner on 5th Street. We talked about our grandkids and our gardens and the small victories of getting older without giving up. Janet said, "You're part of the club now." The grandmothers who said no. She said, "There's more of us than you'd think. We just don't talk about it because family conflict isn't polite conversation. But it should be," I thought, because staying silent is how people like Richard win. Silence is how shame works, how manipulation works. I started volunteering at the community center, teaching a basic financial literacy class for seniors, helping people understand their documents, their rights, how to protect themselves. Patricia came and spoke once about estate planning, about wills and trusts, and the importance of having everything in writing. After class, women would come up to me quietly. They'd say, "My son wants me to co-sign a loan. My daughter says I should add her name to my bank account. My son-in-law says I should help with their business." They'd say, "Is that okay? Should I do it?" And I'd say, "What does your gut tell you? What would you tell your best friend if she asked you the same question?" Most of them already knew the answer. They just needed permission to trust themselves. 6 months after the meeting in Patricia's office, my son and Melissa invited me to Sunday dinner at their house. My grandson answered the door. He'd lost another tooth. He said, "Grandma, come see my room. I painted it." He dragged me upstairs to show me his walls, now blue like the ocean, with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. Melissa had made pot roast, my recipe, the one my husband used to love. She served it with nervous pride. She said, "I know it's not as good as yours, but I'm trying." We ate dinner. We talked about normal things, school, work, the neighbor's dog who kept getting loose. My grandson told us about his science project, something about volcanoes. He was so excited he could barely sit still. After dinner, after my grandson went to play, my son said, "Mom, I want to show you something." He pulled out a folder, bank statements, budget spreadsheets, payment plans. He said, "We're doing it. Slowly, but we're doing it." We paid off 2 credit cards. We're current on the mortgage. We even started a small emergency fund. I looked at the numbers, at the discipline they represented, at the choices to say no to easy things in favor of hard things. I said, "I'm proud of you." He said, "I'm learning what Dad tried to teach me, that a man takes care of what's his, that you don't run from hard work, that you keep your word." He said, "I forgot that for a while. I let fear make me weak, but I'm remembering." Melissa said we're also in counseling, marriage counseling. She said we needed help. We needed someone outside the family to help us see patterns. She said my father has very strong opinions about how things should be, and I've spent my whole life trying to please him. She said I'm learning that I don't have to, that his approval isn't worth destroying my marriage or my family. I said that's brave. I said it's hard to stand up to parents. She smiled, a real smile. She said, "I learned from watching you." That night, driving home, I thought about my husband, about what he'd think of all this, the struggle, the conflict, the resolution. I thought he'd be sad it happened, but proud of how it ended, proud that I'd stood my ground, proud that our son was learning to stand his own ground. I pulled into my driveway. I looked at my house. The porch light was on. I'd left it on that morning, not knowing if I'd come home to an empty house or to the memory of pancakes and laughter. I'd gotten both. The house was empty now, but it had been full earlier, and it would be full again next Saturday. I went inside. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table with the mail. Property tax notice. I could pay it. Insurance renewal. I could pay that too. A letter from the community center thanking me for volunteering. A postcard from Tom and his wife, away visiting their daughter. My life was small, quiet. Not the big dramatic family gatherings I'd once imagined for my later years, but it was mine. Built on truth instead of fear, on boundaries instead of guilt, on self-respect instead of martyrdom. In the bedroom, I opened the closet where I kept my husband's things. I hadn't been able to give them away. His flannel shirts, his work boots, the watch he wore every day for 30 years. I pulled out a small wooden box from the top shelf. Inside were letters he'd written me over the years, anniversary cards, birthday notes, little scraps of paper with "I love you" scribbled in his handwriting. I found the one I was looking for, written 2 months before he died, before the heart attack, before everything changed. He'd left it on my pillow one morning. It said, "You're stronger than you know. If something happens to me, don't let anyone make you small. Don't let anyone take what we built. You deserve to take up space in this world. I love you. Always." He'd known. Somehow he'd known I'd need to hear that. Need permission to be strong. Need reminder that taking up space wasn't selfish. I put the letter back. I closed the box. I got ready for bed in the house that was mine, in the room where I'd slept beside my husband for 32 years, in the space I'd almost given away because I thought being a good mother, a good grandmother, meant making myself smaller so everyone else could be comfortable. But that wasn't love. That was fear, and I'd learned the difference. Sunday morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through the curtains. I made coffee. I sat on the deck my husband had built, and I watched the neighborhood wake up. Kids on bikes, couples walking dogs, normal life, beautiful in its ordinariness. My phone buzzed, a text from my son, a photo, my grandson in his soccer uniform, gap-toothed grin, holding a ball. First game next Saturday. Want to come? I texted back. I'll be there. Another text from Melissa. Thanks for everything, Mom. For not giving up on us, for showing me what strong looks like. I set my phone down. I sipped my coffee. I thought about strength, real strength, not the loud kind, not the kind that demands attention, the quiet kind, the kind that says no when no is necessary, the kind that forgives when forgiveness is earned, the kind that protects what matters without apology. My husband had left me this house, but he'd left me something more important. He'd left me the example of a life lived with dignity, with clear boundaries, with the understanding that you can love people and still protect yourself, that you can be generous without being a doormat. That family is important, but so is self-respect. I was 63 years old. I'd lost my husband. I'd almost lost my son. I'd almost lost my home. But I hadn't lost myself. And that, in the end, was the only thing that really mattered. The house stood solid around me, the deck under my feet. The walls my husband had insisted on building extra sturdy because he wanted me to be safe. The kitchen where we'd made memories, the bedroom where we'd dreamed, the living room where my grandson would play next Saturday after his soccer game. This was my inheritance. Not just the building, not just the equity. The knowledge that I could stand in the storm and not break, that I could love my family and still say no, that I could be a grandmother without being a victim. I finished my coffee. I had errands to run, groceries to buy, a life to live, a small, quiet, beautiful life in the house that was mine, in the space I'd fought to keep, in the peace I'd earned. And next Saturday, I'd make pancakes. I'd watch my grandson's soccer game. I'd hug my son. I'd be polite to Melissa. I'd build the slow, careful bridge back to family. Not the family I'd lost, a different family, one built on honesty instead of obligation, on respect instead of fear. It wouldn't be perfect. There would be hard days still, awkward moments, old wounds that ached, but it would be real, and real was better than easy. Truth was better than peace, bought with silence. I stood up. I looked at my house one more time, my home, my sanctuary, my proof that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to be moved. And I smiled. If this story has touched your heart, subscribe now, leave a like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. That helps us keep sharing stories of strong women, families, and the unexpected turns of life. Remember, this is a dramatized fictional story for entertainment only. It does not provide legal, medical, or financial advice. Viewer discretion is advised. See you in the next video.